Carmine Sandal's health had already been failing before the deaths of his sons. Dr. Sloan had warned him. He had given Carmine a limited amount of time. Carmine refused to accept the seriousness of his condition. He was stubborn. He had always been stubborn. But the loss of Joe and Nick changed him. The ranch had once been his entire life. Now the ranch seemed to remind him of everything he had lost. Barnaby spoke with Dr. Sloan. The doctor confirmed that Carmine had been seriously ill for some time. The family had been informed. Joe had known. Nick had known. Michael had known. That information was important. Barnaby now had another question. Who stood to benefit if Carmine died? Joe was gone. Nick was gone. Michael remained. Michael had always been described as the poor relation. He worked for the family. He had inherited responsibility rather than wealth. If the family changed completely, Michael could become the most important person left on the ranch. Barnaby began watching him more carefully. Michael appeared calm. He spoke respectfully. He helped Carmine. He cooperated with the investigation. He seemed concerned about Thomas. But sometimes concern could be useful. Barnaby had learned that people could hide motives behind good intentions. Meanwhile, Linda was struggling with another decision. She wanted to help Tomas. She knew he was hiding. She knew the authorities wanted to question him. She also feared that revealing everything about her past would make people believe Tomas was guilty. She felt trapped between two impossible choices. Silence might protect Tomas temporarily. The truth might clear him. But the truth was painful. Barnaby returned to speak with her. He told her that the investigation could not move forward without understanding what had happened. Linda finally trusted him. She explained everything she could remember. She emphasized that Tomas did not know the full story. That meant the revenge theory was weak. Barnaby realized something else. If Tomas had no knowledge of the worst part of Linda's experience, then someone who did know could have used that information to manipulate the investigation. Someone could make Tomas appear guilty. Someone could rely on the town's willingness to believe the worst. That person had to know Linda. That person had to know the Sandal family. That person had to understand Tomas. Barnaby returned to the ranch. He questioned Michael. Michael repeated his earlier claims. He said Tomas had always been angry. He said Thomas had been fired. He said Thomas had reasons to resent Joe. Barnaby asked whether Michael had ever considered that Thomas might be innocent. Michael hesitated. Then he said that innocent people did not usually disappear. Barnaby did not answer. He knew that was not necessarily true. People disappeared for many reasons. Fear was one of them. Tomas was afraid. He had good reason to believe the town had already judged him. Michael continued talking. He described Thomas as unstable. He emphasized the confrontation at the feed store. He mentioned the knife. Barnaby listened. Then, he asked a simple question. Why had Michael been so interested in making Thomas look guilty? Michael said he was simply protecting the family. Barnaby accepted the answer for the moment. But he remembered it. Every investigator develops an instinct for repetition. When someone returns to the same point again and again, it can mean the point is important. Or, it can mean the person wants everyone else to think it is important. Barnaby began looking at the timeline. Joe died. Linda returned. Thomas became angry. Nick and Michael confronted him. Nick died. Thomas disappeared. The pattern seemed to point toward Thomas. But the pattern was almost too convenient. Barnaby asked Jedediah to examine the movements of the people involved. He wanted to know where everyone had been. He wanted independent confirmation. He wanted to separate rumor from fact. Meanwhile, Tomas was hiding. Victor found him. Tomas told Victor that he wanted to leave. He believed the ranch would never accept him again. Victor told him that was not true. Tomas said the town had already decided. Victor replied that towns were not always right. Tomas laughed bitterly. He said that towns were often wrong. Victor agreed. Then, he told Tomas that running would make everything harder. Tomas said that staying could make him a target. Victor could not argue with that. The two men sat quietly. Tomas admitted that he was tired. Not physically. Emotionally. He had spent years protecting Linda. He had spent years trying to understand what had happened. Now 2 people were dead. Everyone thought he was responsible. He did not know how to prove otherwise. Victor told him that he did not have to prove everything himself. There were people searching for the truth. Tomas asked whether Victor trusted Barnaby. Victor said yes. That was enough to make Tomas consider returning. But he was not ready. Back at the ranch, Linda was becoming increasingly anxious. She knew Tomas was in danger. She also knew that someone else might be manipulating the situation. She went to Victor. She asked whether he knew where Tomas was. Victor hesitated. Linda immediately understood.
He did.
But he had promised not to betray Tomas. Linda begged him to reconsider. Victor said Tomas was like a son to him. Linda replied that if Tomas was in danger, protecting him meant helping Barnaby. Victor understood. He agreed to deliver a message. Tomas would meet Barnaby. He would choose the location. He would come alone. That arrangement gave Tomas some control. It also gave Barnaby a chance to speak with him privately. When they finally met, Barnaby told Tomas something simple. He did not believe the story against him. Tomas was surprised. Barnaby explained that suspicion was not proof. He also told Tomas that Linda had been brave. She had finally told the truth. Tomas became quiet. He asked whether Linda had told Barnaby everything. Barnaby said she had told enough. Tomas was relieved. He had spent years trying to protect her privacy. Now he understood that she had chosen to speak because someone else was in danger. Barnaby asked Tomas about Joe. Tomas said he had never wanted Joe dead. He had been angry with him. He had disliked him. But anger and murder were not the same thing. Barnaby agreed. Then he asked Tomas about Michael. Tomas hesitated. He said Michael had always seemed different. He was part of the family, but never quite part of it. He worked hard. He resented being treated like a subordinate. Tomas had never trusted him completely.
Barnaby asked why.
Tomas could not give a clear reason. It was a feeling. Barnaby took it seriously. He returned to the ranch. Michael was gone. That worried him. Jedediah reported that Michael had left unexpectedly. Barnaby immediately realized that the investigation had reached a critical moment. He told the sheriff to search for Michael. Linda arrived soon afterward. She was frightened. She believed Michael might be looking for Tomas. Barnaby reassured her that they would find him. But Linda had another thought. She asked whether Michael could have known about what happened 3 years earlier. Barnaby asked why she thought so. She said that Michael had been at the inn that night. That detail changed everything. Michael had been there. Donna had confirmed it. The Sandal brothers had been there. Michael had been there too. Barnaby now understood the connection. Michael knew the history. Michael knew about Linda. Michael knew about Tomas.
Michael knew about the Sandal family.
Michael also knew that Carmine's health was failing. And if Michael had created a story in which Thomas appeared responsible for the deaths, he could benefit from the confusion. Barnaby and Jedediah began searching. They found evidence that Michael had been moving around the area. The timeline became clearer. Barnaby realized that Michael had not simply been reacting to events. He had been anticipating them. He had been guiding people towards certain conclusions. He had encouraged suspicion of Thomas. He had emphasized the confrontation at the feed store. He had repeatedly reminded everyone that Thomas had a reason to be angry. The story had been carefully constructed. But there was one weakness. Michael had underestimated Linda. He had assumed that her silence would continue. He had assumed that Tomas knew everything. He had assumed that the town would never question the obvious explanation. Those assumptions were beginning to collapse. Barnaby finally confronted Michael. Michael tried to remain calm. He claimed that he had done nothing wrong. Barnaby asked where he had been. Michael gave an answer. Barnaby already knew it was false. He showed him the contradictions. Michael became defensive. He accused Barnaby of protecting Thomas. Barnaby said he was protecting the truth. Michael insisted that Thomas was dangerous. Barnaby replied that Michael seemed unusually interested in making sure everyone believed that. The conversation became tense. Michael finally revealed his motive. He had spent years feeling like an outsider. Carmine had taken him in after his father's death. But Michael never felt equal. He worked. He obeyed. He watched Joe receive Carmine's approval. He watched Nick complain about Joe. He watched the family fight among itself. He believed that he deserved more. He believed the ranch should have been his. The return of Linda had created an opportunity. Old secrets could be reopened. Old rivalries could be revived. Thomas could become the obvious suspect. And while everyone looked at him, Michael could move quietly. His plan had depended on one thing: confusion. He needed everyone to believe that the answer was already obvious. He needed people to stop asking questions. But Barnaby had continued asking. That was why the plan was failing. Michael admitted that he had expected Tomas to behave exactly as he did. He knew Tomas was protective. He knew he was emotional. He knew that a confrontation would make him look suspicious. Michael had used those characteristics against him. Barnaby told him that he had mistaken anger for guilt. Michael replied that in a small town, suspicion was often enough. Barnaby disagreed. He said suspicion might control rumors. It could not control the truth. The truth eventually found its way through. Michael's carefully arranged story began collapsing. The timeline did not support everything he had claimed. Linda's testimony weakened the revenge theory. Tomas's actions could be explained without assuming guilt. And Michael's own movements became increasingly difficult to explain. The investigation was finally moving toward the person who had benefited from the confusion. But the emotional damage could not be undone so easily. Carmine had lost 2 sons. Linda had spent years carrying painful memories. Tomas had lived under suspicion. Victor had been forced to choose between loyalty and truth. No arrest could restore what had been lost. Barnaby knew that. He also knew that truth was still necessary. Without truth, there could be no real beginning.